We're here to help you. Whatever you need, essential home appliances, local store opening times, advice or delivery options. Visit expert.ie for the latest updates. We're Expert Electrical. We're here to help you.
Off the ball. This is News Talk.
Okay, you're very welcome back. So as we mentioned before the ad break there, we are, with thanks to our friends at Virgin, picking out Champions League moments. We're inviting various people on. We had Neil Mellor on last week, who scored goals in the Champions League, right through to, economists in this case, who remember Champions League moments very fondly. It is all with thanks to Virgin, and as a Virgin Media TV customer, you can enjoy classic weekends of sport. I'm sure you've seen lately they have had a Manchester United weekend, they've had a Liverpool weekend, so it's all available across various weekends on Virgin Media Sport. And David McWilliams, I'm sure you are waiting with bated breath for the Leeds United weekend on Virgin Media. When is this Leeds United weekend coming?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that it's only a matter of time. The 6th of June, we'll be back in. There's a couple of victories back to back, and it's all sewn up, and we're back in the Premiership, where we should have been for many years. Well, indeed. So that's the party political broadcast on behalf of Leeds United FC. Who knows, Joe? Who knows what's going to happen? But I must admit, it would be a real treat as a long-suffering fan of Leeds United to see Leeds United in the Premiership at a certain stage. And in actual fact, maybe I'm being too generous in this regard or too optimistic, but I think a lot of football fans would like to see Leeds in the Premiership. And I think Leeds would add something to the Premiership, particularly just in terms of gates and crowds and all that sort of stuff. I mean, Leeds is, I know it sounds weird, I was trying to explain to my son, I was trying to explain that Leeds is actually a big club, but he was like, yeah, Dad, whatever. But, he's of the generation of Chelsea fans who are now in their late teens, who came of age during Chelsea's pomp. And he can't really equate Leeds the city, Leeds the sense of it, with a team that could be actually quite good. But let's see. Let us see.
So I'm sure, I fully suspect we'll get on to 2001. I mean, that is the season. But why Leeds for you? What hooked you in?
I think it's very, very hard to say. It's an age thing. Born in the late 60s, Leeds are the team to watch in the early 70s, or at least they seemed to be in our road. And our road really kind of came down. It was Man United, Liverpool, or Leeds. And I was probably the tail end of the Leeds fans. I think if you were born in the early 60s, you were definitely a Leeds supporter. And there was a smattering always of West Ham for the kind of contrarians, Arsenal for the people who kind of suffer diseases rather than follow football clubs and have to go through a long period. I'm trying to think who else was there. Aston Villa always had a little small support, but of the big three, it was Liverpool, United, and Leeds. And Leeds fans and Liverpool fans certainly went one way, were slightly interchangeable as a kid. Man United never. That was just the omerta, I remember, as a young fella. And again, it was probably Johnny Giles. You know, if you actually think about it, he was the one Irish footballer at the time who was a standout player. And it was also to do with success. It's funny you mentioned it, though, the early 70s. Roddy Doyle, who is a Chelsea fan, I'm not sure if you know this, but has a severe exposure to Chelsea. On occasions, I would get a text from Roddy Doyle, and all it would say is, "Cook to Osgood," which is the pass in the 1970 FA Cup final replay in Old Trafford, where Chelsea destroyed Leeds. So it's a long thing. So if you ever see Roddy Doyle, ask him just so Cook to Osgood, and he'll know exactly what he's all about. So it's an age thing, and it's an early 70s thing. And then throughout the 70s and 80s, and then Leeds started to just fall asunder. Then, of course, you had the 1992 First Division Championship. And then, of course, you bring it up to the Dave O'Leary days. And since then, it's been a barren patch. But, you know, it's the character building, Joe, character building.
Much like our current predicament. If you remember that 2001 squad, even the most fervent anti-Leeds types out there would have had to acknowledge that David O'Leary squad, full of the young babies, as he liked to call them, they were
My baby.
Very,
Yeah.
very likable in many, many ways. Very exciting. And even just, I had to look back at the 0-1 squad of that Champions League season, and the names will jump out to people. Gary Kelly and Ian Hart. That was kind of cool from an Irish perspective.
Yeah, it was cool from an Irish perspective. And Hart could score. Do you remember Hart could score goals? Like he could. This is a fellow. Have we had a free kick taker since Ian Hart? I don't think so. Maybe Robbie Brady might have a sniff of that.
But not of the class of Hart, though.
Not of the class. No, not, yeah, certainly not in Green. We haven't had one, no.
So you had those two. That was so from an Irish point of view, that was good. You had Lucas Radaby, captain. You had Jonathan Woodgate.
Maybe the first South African captain as well, you know. Right. And actually a very political geezer as well, Lucas Radaby, and very, very interesting to hear him on South Africa, apartheid, all that stuff. Woodgate, was he 19, 20? He's a young fellow.
Very young, and just right away looked class.
Yeah.
Then Bowyer was doing his thing. You had David Batty, you had Viduka, you had Robbie Keane, you had Michael Bridges before his injury. He was a very good player before that. You had Alan Smith. You had some young kid called Rio Ferdinand coming through. Like the names. Well, that is a fun team.
It's a great team. And in actual fact, if you ever listen to Roy Keane talking about proper opponents who actually gave him a game in the middle of the park, everyone thinks the Vieira Keane, but he always claims that actually David Batty used to give him a game in the middle of the park. And Leeds always needed that. They always need Lorimer, Batty, that sort of hard man in the middle of the pitch who can actually bully a game if you have to. And, you know, Viduka, an amazing, amazing talent. They were a really good team. They were a really good team. And on the fringes of that team, there were people like Harry Cool as well, who could really, really play. I don't know what happened to him when he went to Liverpool, but certainly at Leeds, he was a fine player. Was Robbie Fowler sniffing around a little bit later?
A touch later on. Yeah.
No, so it was an extremely good team, and it was an extremely good team to watch as well. And as you said, the anti-Leeds brigade, of which there are many, who suggest that basically it's all a matter of Leeds being a
dirty Leeds is what we're talking about.
Yeah, biting your legs, all that sort of stuff. No, they were a great team, and O'Leary. I mean, I think I'm not too sure that history has been that kind to David O'Leary. I think that to create a team like that, and of course, the boss, what was his name? Lonsdale, was that his name?
Ridsdale, Peter Ridsdale.
Ridsdale. Yeah. Ridsdale was writing big checks, but you have to spend money to win these championships, these big competitions. And the only problem with that was that, if you don't, we know that what happens. The whole thing spirals out of control, which it did in a kind of a pathetic couple of subsequent seasons. And now we've had the Leeds in the championship period, which again, as I said, it creates a backbone.
I want to give you some of the games from that 0-1 season, and you can tell me which one jumps out as the moment for you, the lingering memory all these years later. This, by the way, and younger listeners will be horrified, this was when they went for 2 group stages in the Champions League, just to really make everyone miserable. So you had to go through
That's
2
true. That's true.
Money grab of the highest order. So I mean, Leeds did not do this the easy way. Some of the results, for your first group game in the Champions League was a 4-0 loss away to Barcelona. Then there was a 1-0 win against AC Milan, very famously. And then 1-1 draws with Barcelona at Ellen Road, and a 1-1 draw at Milan. You sneak through to group stage number 2, and waiting for you there, Real Madrid, where you lose both times to Real Madrid. The 3-3 draw away to Lazio gets you through to quarterfinals. And then I suppose a magic day, April 4th, quarterfinal home leg against Deportivo, a 3-0 win.
Oh, a 3-0 win. Yeah. I mean, and then you think it's all sunny day. But actually, just think of the teams there. Lazio, AC, Real, Barca. I mean, this is the sort of thing that any football fan dreams of. Yeah. That the team that they support are going to actually be playing at that level and actually giving these guys a pretty torrid time, And then, of course, Deportivo rumbled the whole thing, didn't they?
Well, no, you beat Deportivo 3-0, and then you lose 2-0 away. So that's quarterfinals. So you're through to the semi-finals against Valencia. That started well. 0-0 draw at home to Valencia. You went to Spain, lost 3-0, and that
Yeah.
was the end of the dream. But what a dream!
I-
Where were you in your life at that
What
stage?
was?
No one.
I was back here in Dublin. Do you know what I was doing? I was presenting a show on TV3 called Agenda,
Oh, yeah.
and I was a bit in London as well, so I was kind of commuting back and forth all the time. And also, my daughter was only about 1 year old, so I was at that stage where there was very little sleep in the house, and I do remember me kind of slipping out to watch football and not being regarded as being the best husband in the world. You'd come home and slip out, but it was an interesting period, because what is interesting in every football fan's, what I would call kind of the arc of their thing, is sometimes when you see a campaign like this, you think, your natural instinct to think this is the beginning of something beautiful, but in actual fact it was the end, and you don't realize at the time that this is as good as it gets, because your natural inclination to say, okay, the team is young.
Yeah.
You know, Valencia, there was a guy in the middle of the park for Valencia, a Basque player. What was his name? I can't remember. Mendieta. Yeah, and I do remember him being kind of head and shoulders everybody else, and you kind of realized, I think he went off, did he go to AC or did he go to Lazio or something? He went to Italy.
He did get a big move down the line, yeah, but he
got a big move.
Scored a penalty for Spain against Ireland in the World Cup the following year.
And yeah, he was a proper player. And that was when you realized the Spaniards were onto something as well. Because, I mean, again, this is when the Spanish clubs start to begin to just destroy everybody. The Spanish national team begins the process of becoming the team that we know they are. And so I've always felt, it's interesting, Joe, I've always loved watching soccer in general, okay? The Leeds thing is more of an affliction than anything else, you know? But I've always, and one of the great things about the Champions League back then, it's again maybe difficult for younger listeners to realize, is that we were kind of unfamiliar with many of the players, in the sense that the Champions League wasn't what it is now. Like, it wasn't beamed into houses every Tuesday and Wednesday night. It was still a sort of an exotic thing. So, you know, you wouldn't know much about Lazio. You wouldn't know much about Valencia. You wouldn't know much about the players. And they were a joy to watch. And I always remember, there was that feeling I used to have at World Cups when I was younger as well, that you'd see players in the World Cup and you'd never have heard them before. Whereas now, I think, unfortunately, there's no real surprises in the game. You know, everybody knows everything about, you know, the stats. And this is the world before assists and stats and all this malarkey. So in actual fact, I think if you look at classic football matches, there is a sort of an innocence about them. And there is a sort of a free-flowing feel to them that in this sort of statistically obsessed age, you don't get. And also, footballers made a lot of mistakes in the past. Whereas you don't see that sort of same micromanagement that I fear you get now.
On the bust, if that was the boom, like if that magic of that season was the boom, and as you said, as good as it gets, Peter Ridsdale, the famous quote from Ridsdale afterwards was, "We tried to live the dream." And what turned out to have been the case was that Leeds effectively had borrowed £60 million, very much with the intention of qualifying for the Champions League again. But they did over the following two seasons. And suddenly, I had a look at the figures. In 2002, they lost 34 million. In 2003, they somehow managed to lose 50 million. And what was amazing was how quickly the whole thing just went up in flames. It was quite, I'd say the economist in you and the Leeds fan in you.
Leeds,
believe it.
Listen, so Joe, Leeds United were the Anglo-Irish banks of football teams, okay? Right? It was the Anglo football teams. It was actually the same model. And I actually remember at the time writing about Leeds in my Sunday Business Post column in around 2006 to suggest that this is exactly what's going to happen to us. That you have, no matter what you do, okay, if you base your entire edifice on leverage, on other people's money, every single thing has to go right for you in order for you to succeed. And if one part of that equation goes wrong, if one supposition you have, expectation or assumption you have goes wrong, then the entire house of cards falls down, because everything is related to everything else. And so you see in Leeds, this disaster was number one, Champions League, But much more importantly, number two, you have these ridiculous fixed costs, right? Another way, like you're seeing now, Premiership players, they're all under pressure. Should they get paid? Should they not? You know, your wages, your wage bill in the expectation of most clubs, I'd say your wage bill would have been regarded as something variable, right? But actually, when you actually have a very fixed wage bill and it's incredibly high, I can't remember what Leeds paid Robbie Keane, but there was something ridiculous that Leeds were still paying Robbie when he was playing. Did he go back to Wolves years later or something?
They were paying him for a long time afterwards. Robbie Fowler, I think, was still getting paid up until about 3 or 4 years ago.
And Robbie Fowler owned every house in Leeds at the time as well. Do you not remember that Robbie Fowler was the biggest landlord in north of England?
I think
we all live
in a Robbie Fowler house. Yeah,
we all live in a Robbie Fowler house. These are great tunes. These are this is proper socioeconomic stuff. Yeah. You go to the terrace, you get it all made out for you. So I mean, yeah. So Leeds was kind of it was the Anglo of football clubs. So on the way up, everyone thought they were geniuses, and on the way down, the whole edifice fell apart dramatically, and it happens quickly. This is the interesting thing. You know, it's about bankruptcy and clubs that go bankrupt, people that go bankrupt. Hemingway was asked, how did you go bankrupt? Because Hemingway went bankrupt and nobody could understand how this amazing writer, you know, one of the world's greats, and from an early stage in his life, one of the greats, you know, and acknowledged as the greats. And he said, he was asked, well, Mr. Hemingway, how did you go bankrupt? And he looked at the person, he said, well, at first very slowly and then very quickly. And the same thing happens to Leeds, and the same thing happens in all bankruptcies. At first, it's kind of, it'll be grand, don't worry, we'll figure it all out. And then it happens quickly. But now you have to look in the upside, Joe, which is, it could be all a new dawn. The back end of 2020 could be the beginning of the Leeds Renaissance.
I had heard that quote. I didn't know that was I didn't know that was Hemingway. Didn't know that was Hemingway.
Yeah, it's Hemingway. So what happened with Hemingway was that Hemingway became very famous very young in his life. So for the book Fiesta, which was his book about basically going on the lash in Spain, which was made him very, very famous very, very young. And he would have had huge publishing rights and huge amounts of cash. And he was also cool. He was living in Cuba, all that sort of stuff, you know. But like a lot of writers and a lot of artists, they get surrounded by, and a lot of soccer players, actually, a lot of footballers, they get surrounded by agents and hangers-on and yeah. And I think Hemingway was one of the last to realize he was bankrupt. And the question was all, of course, meant to be, how in God's name did someone like you go bankrupt? If someone like you can go bankrupt, anyone can. And he just responded and he said, listen, man, at first it was slowly and then very quickly.
Yeah. On the whole theme of finances and where we are at the moment in broad terms, I've been listening to your podcast for, avidly for a long time, but I suppose like a lot of people with extra attention at the moment, and it's exceptionally good. I'd recommend it to everyone, the David McWilliams podcast. You're not on here to push that, by the way, but I'm
thanks very much, Joe. Thanks. That's lovely, lovely to hear.
I'm such a fan of it. And I know John as well. He used to be in News Talk, but I'm such a fan of it. And you have this incredible ability to make very complex things accessible and interesting. And especially at the moment, it's a great listen because you're taking in a myriad of different components and managing to insert them together to create some kind of picture. Like, for instance, what jumped out at me was, and you've been consistent in this, I think, is that, yes, this is all terrible, but it is manageable if the right things are done. Manageable can still be quite tough, but it's better than disastrous. And I was out for a walk about 2-3 weeks ago, and you stopped me in my tracks, for instance.
Oh my God.
When you said, Christine Lagarde, who I always thought was very impressive and came across, a really good operator. I think that was the phrase you used about her as well. I had just presumed Christine Lagarde had a deep and thorough economic background. She is the president of the ECB. And I think you said she was one of the biggest charlatans in public life. The economic sophistication of junior cert economics was where we had Christine. So that caused me a moment of worry. So talk to us about where we are in broad terms, and crucially, what you would like to see done, but also what will most likely be done, and what's the gap between those 2 points?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. We can come back to Christine in a little while. I suppose that was a bit of a shock for people, but I'll tell you, we can go back to that in a while.
Sure.
I think the most a critical thing, Joe, is it's like everything. It's the way in which you behave and enter a crisis dictates how you actually emerge from a crisis. And the one thing I've noticed about all financial crises is that people always think you run out of money. You actually don't run out of money, you run out of time. And then you make decisions with very, very short time horizons. And those decisions can be taken too quickly and also can't see the totality of what's happening. What's happening is, and still remains, a pandemic. If you look at the history of pandemics, and the podcast allows me to indulge my interest in history, for example, you go back to the Black Death, which was the pandemic that really defined pandemics. It was 1347. You go to the city that was the center of business, finance, culture in the world at the time, was Florence in Italy. And what you see is a very rapid recovery from a pandemic that kills maybe 1/3 of the population there. And you think to yourself, well, why is that? And then you go to for example, the flu pandemic let's say 1918 to 1921 by the time it was all done with. And you look at the response of their various different countries, and you see two very different responses. One is the United States, which emerges from that pandemic as an extraordinarily innovative and financially very, very muscular and robust country. And then you look at, for example, what happened in Germany, and you see a country that went into a decade-long spiral of chaos and leading to Hitler, etc. So again, it's all about what you do to prepare yourself. It strikes me that the most worrying thing for most businesses is that they'll run out of money. And then if you run out of money because you're not trading, your doors are closed, you only have a certain amount of cash flow. Once that cash is gone, you don't have any cash, not only to spread to pay whatever amount of your payroll you've kept on board, but also to pay your suppliers, etc. So the question is then, is it possible to get cash directly into businesses? And this is where I think we're making a mistake, and it's a mistake that can be rectified very easily. There is this thing called helicopter money, which I know a lot of people weren't aware of, but it's part of economics and crisis management, where you just actually, the central bank just deposits money into people's accounts. And it seems too easy. And that's the interesting thing about the way in which we've all been educated. We've all been educated to think that things are too easy, can't be done, because they're too easy, that very, very effective things have to be difficult, but they don't. And I think that this is where, in actual fact, the United States announced it this morning, that they are going to be putting checks, they're going to be giving checks to people. I think it's a couple of grand to every citizen. We should do that on a large, large scale. And the interesting thing about the ECB, to come back to Christine Lagarde, is the ECB seems to have been, in my opinion, maybe under the influence of Philip Lane, the Irish guy who's the chief economist. They realize now that they've said to governments, look, you can do whatever you want, right? We're kind of going to turn a blind eye, and we'll figure it out when we get out of this. So if we stop the fear of a credit crunch, and if we stop people's fear of running out of money by actually depositing free money, and it can be free. This is the interesting thing, is I've always said, is this is what I call the awesome power of central banks. Is the central banks are important institutions because they have at their disposal the extraordinary power, which is the power to actually print money. And if you have that power, and if you've built up credibility over 10, 15, 20 years, then you should deploy it in a crisis. So my sense is, if we do that, and I think it is coming, it's a bit like, economics is a bit like religion, Joe. There are high priests of dogma, and then there are heretics, okay? All under the one church. And central bankers, of which I used to be one when my first job was working as an economist in the Central Bank in Ireland, are driven by dogma. And anyone who's driven by dogma means they don't see the other options. And one of the dogmatic things is you cannot print money because that will lead to inflation. But the problem here is we're not going to be faced with inflation. In fact, what we're faced with now is a once in a century, maybe, deflationary shock. And the way you combat deflation is inflation through printing money. So that, I think, is a crucial intellectual challenge for the economics fraternity to digest, which is that everything you have learned and all the assumptions are now suspended in the face of COVID, because COVID is a pandemic which we never expected, or at least most people never expected to happen. So my sense, Joe, is that if we do, and this could go on for a while, if we do radical things now, we will have a much gentler re-entry into normal life. And I mean, what is also interesting about crises, Joe, is that what was mainstream in a crisis quickly becomes redundant, okay? And what was radical quickly becomes mainstream. And that, I think, is something we have to keep in the back of our minds. So my sense is that although there are certain people, and people I respect, who believe that this is the beginning of a decade-long apocalypse in the Western economies, which will lead to all sorts of dislocation. My own sense is that if we can manage it right now, and if we do the right things now, and if we abandon the rule book and think radically and a little bit courageously, I think it can be managed. I really do.
Well, that's good to hear. I have two quick responses to that. One, I had wondered why, if we printed a load of money, we would not be going the same way as the Weimar Republic. So that's interesting. You say we've had a deflationary shock,
yeah.
And so we'll get away with it. The second thing I wanted to just ask you about as well, the behavioral economics of all this going forward must be close to uncharted. Like, for instance, how quickly people feel comfortable going to a concert or a crowded pub. Do we have the roaring 20s where people have just a new verve for life and want to live because, suddenly there's a fragility to everything that we understand in a profound way. So even the changes in our behavior will be crucial, I suspect, in years.
It's really, really interesting you say that because, before Germany hit the buffers, okay, you had the Weimar Republic, which was basically the roaring 20s, Germany style. If you even go back further to the Black Death, what you see is an extraordinary explosion of, what led to the Renaissance, of thinking about the world, of figuring out. So you have Petrarch coming in, rewriting the Renaissance, saying, look, you know what, we can actually become humanists now, we can change science, etc. So you have moments like this that change the world. My own feeling is it might take some time for the reopening of the economy to allow people feel comfortable about going to a gig or a crowded pub or a football match. For example, my wife and I run the Dorky Book Festival, which we have postponed. Was meant to be on the 16th of June, and obviously we've postponed that. And we're thinking, should we pick a date in the autumn and go for it? And that'll be all predicated on whether or not there's a feeling that that people have permission to go back into big groups. So I think that clearly there will be some short-term issues. But Joe, and I'd really caution people, what we notice in pandemics is that they don't have profoundly long-term impacts on human behavior. They have long-term impacts on intellectualism and on politics, but on human behavior. And the reason is very simple, is the economy is chatty. I've always said that it's chatty. The economy is social, and we are a social animal. And in fact, the whole evolution of humanity is based on the fact that what sets us apart from other animals is our innate sociability and our willingness to talk and engage. And I've always felt like the worst thing you can do to a human in terms of punishment is put one of us in solitary confinement, because we go mad without each other. So it's not natural for this animal, the human, to be in isolation, in confinement, in quarantine for any length of period of time. So I think the evolutionary momentum of the social animal will far outweigh the short-term legacy issues of the pandemic.
Okay, well, here's hoping. I mean,
well, I know what you mean. I mean, it could be wrong, but that's the way it seems to me.
Okay, very good. Were you going to come in with a final thought there? Sorry? No.
No,
that's all fascinating. And then a quick final word on Lagarde, because where this came about was when she came out fairly quickly to say, I think Italy were in a bad way, and said, look, we're not bailing everybody out here. We're not doing that. And within 2 days or a day even, I think the powers that be at the ECB had announced what was it, 750 billion?
Yeah. But it goes back. It goes back much further than that. I remember during our crisis and during the Celtic Tiger and then the complete collapse and everything, she was the finance minister of France.
Yeah.
And she parlayed her way into the IMF, which is basically a French. If you study these things, the IMF is a French sinecure that the French tend to express their political power through their grasping of the commanding heights of many institutions, the IMF being one. I mean, Strauss-Kahn was there before her, and then you have Lamfalussy, all these many French bureaucrats.
Right.
And what Christine Lagarde is, she's a lawyer. And lawyers tend to know very little about economics. But in fact, they tend to be the people who feel most compelled to explain economics to you, even though they don't really have a good grasp of it. And the reason is simple, is they believe in the permanence of contracts. And that therefore supposes the world is static. But in actual fact, the world is very dynamic and changes all the time, and contracts are only valid at a certain point in time, right? For example, to go back to the Leeds situation, the contracts that those players signed were predicated on success. So as soon as those contracts hit the reality of failure, those contracts themselves became null and void, not because anything had profoundly changed in the contract, but the world had changed. So if you come to an economic position as a lawyer, you're largely going to be legalistic. So what Lagarde said to the Italians is, in a very narrow framework, it is not the ECB's job to bail out the Italian bond market, which she said. And legalistically, that's possibly right. But in actual fact, that forgot the responsibility of a central bank in a global crisis, which is actually to preserve the system. So what you get is the legalistically narrow view obscuring the very, very big picture, which is what is the real prize here. And the real prize is saving the system. And again, as I said, Lagarde was so absolute on a Thursday about her own view, and then the following Wednesday, not only did she reverse her view, but reversed it totally. And this is part of her. I've watched it for many years. This is part of a pattern of behavior. But I come back to the fact that there is a long history since the Second World War of French functionaries parachuting themselves into very, very highfalutin and powerful positions, which is one of the ways, this idea of power, soft power and hard power. One of the ways in which France has exercised its power over the years has been in major financial organizations to put its people at the very, very top, to give a French flavor to the top, irrespective of whether they're qualified or not.
Right. Well, from Peter Ridsdale to Christine Lagarde, we've got there. So thanks so much for doing that. Keep up the great work on the podcast. That was you're needless to say, 2001 is your Virgin Media Sport Champions League memory, and you're campaigning for them to revisit that in depth very soon, I would suspect. Give you
absolutely. Cheers, Joe.
David, thanks so much. Goodbye.
Off the Ball on News Talk.